Hi, I'm Deborah Cohen. We also are obviously an unchaired session, so I'm going to follow Sharon's lead. The other thing I would say is I think this is going to be a great technological challenge, both for me and for Tom, because neither of us, to put it politely, are still people. And so to manage to converse with each other and also to be mic'd. Does this sound okay? Okay, I'm going to proceed as Oprah then. Okay, so I'm Deborah, Tom, obviously. And what we're going to talk about really are three things. Number one is the institutional setting at Berkeley, since what's clear, and was I think probably clear coming in, is just how much your individual location mattered. And so part of what we want to do is conjure up that Berkeley moment, which I think one can't really do without the hot tub and the 7 kinds of organic plums, about which I feel judgmental and prissy, but whatever. But we'll try. The second thing that we want to do is talk about a moment of integration when women's history and gender history became very much part of the fabric of intellectual life at Berkeley. And the third is a moment of cultural history, or the continuities of cultural history. And I want to start off by saying that I came from the really supremely rigorous and supportive environment of being in the first class of women's studies concentrators at Harvard, which, because it was Harvard, actually took a very long time to happen, starting in 1987. And I say rigorously, really supremely rigorous and supportive, because we were being trained from within Fortress Women's Studies to go out and conquer the world. Olwen Houghton, Sonia Michel, then Alex Owen. This was an Anglo-American world. I think it's important that it was run at some point by Alex and Olwen, who were not tremendously deferential to the Harvard system. It was run with the support of a largely female faculty with the occasional junior faculty man, usually gay. We had fierce arguments. There was scrupulous attention paid to mentoring. Susan Peterson, my beloved senior thesis advisor, line edited my senior thesis, which is a tribute I think Sue can pay as well to feminist mentoring. So I came to Berkeley in 1991, and to some extent, what struck me was, first of all, that I was pushing through an open door, that this was a moment of integration, especially on the Franco-British side of things, where gender was everywhere, sexuality too. The work was not particularly viewed as controversial and not seen really as risky. There were certainly stakes in integration. Those have been clear to us, I think, in this conference, and Tom and I will specifically take up how we think about this question later on. But I think a key part is that a number of Tom's students at this moment, and then continuing on, I'm thinking of Lisa Cody, Vanessa Schwartz, Sue Greisel, Nikki Galace, came from women's history interests to Berkeley. And I think, as one of them put it to me, the question was, if half of the population had been ignored, as they had learned as undergraduates, what else was there to work on? I arrived just after the heyday of cultural history, and sort of amidst, I think, what I would call just after the heyday of cultural history, in the sense that Tom was urging his students to do quantitative methods, which I got out of because I was actually learning German to do German history, which kind of counted for the same sort of rigor. However, what I do remember is a kind of methodological Epicureanism. So this is, I think, the moment that produces some of the formation that we were talking about on the last panel. As I said, I was prissy and shocked by a lot of this. Specifically, I remember a conversation that happened at Tom's house, my first year at Berkeley, at the MedHeads, which was a medical history group that was convened at Tom's house, for which he cooked dinner for, I believe, 40 people. Between Vanessa Schwartz and the eminent labor historian Reggie Zelnick. Vanessa explaining to Reggie why she hadn't taken his class, which was the basic European history, introduction for the 19th century. It was a labor history class, as I said. And she said, work's boring. I'm interested in leisure. And I think, again, I was utterly, this was such a shocking thing to confess to. Okay, so that's a little introduction to this, some things of this moment. So I want to start by asking Tom then, how was this kind of atmosphere created, and how conscious was it?
How what?
Conscious.
Well, I think the sociability part of it was very conscious from my point of view. I mean, Lynn Hunt was a close collaborator, and we had students over from when we started collaborating. Kathy Gallagher and I were close collaborators, and we had students over. So I was, and I was brought, and my mentors were really interested in creating student communities. So we always had runs of their libraries, and they got us together for walks, and so that was very conscious, and I thought important, and cross-disciplinary. People from English came, and people from anthropology came to MedHeads, and it was a cross-disciplinary social group, and we had British history reading groups, as you remember, and we had a bunch of these groups that got people together. So that was conscious. The social history and the other moment, I'm not sure how conscious it was, but I think it came, in my case, both from mentoring in a horizontal sense and then also in a vertical sense. So I was just telling Sally Alexander, my main teacher, Lawrence Stone, was driven out of England essentially, and saw Princeton as a place that would create something that wasn't Oxford and that wasn't Harvard. And so the seminar that we began with, I mean, the required seminar for everybody was 4 weeks of Freud, 4 weeks of Durkheim, 4 weeks of Marx, and 4 weeks of Weber. That was no one does that anymore, but that you thought you needed to read Freud. You needed to read all this to have that. So I came from a formation which felt that this was, that and then when I came to Berkeley, you know, my I guess horizontal measures, but over also people of eclectic taste who didn't like boundaries. So Natalie Davis had the office opposite me when I first came to Berkeley, and Chan was in Toronto, and I was single, so we both hung around the office a lot. So you know, I learned a huge amount from her, and she brought in all sorts of interesting people. I mean, she brought in Ariès, she brought in Clapiche, she brought in various art historians. So that was a really important connection. And she also made the issue of women's history and gender history not a problem by simply declaring her course to be it was society and the sexes. And this bibliography that was mentioned yesterday kept growing in Berkeley, but it was never a bibliography of women's history. And so, but then when Carla Hesse and Mary Ryan and I took over the course, we called it Society and Sexes, and it's still called Societies. So there was in my department there was these integrated personalities, and I think Natalie was maybe the most important. And then I think maybe the most important thing in my life was being blessed by this remarkable cohort of colleagues who were all interested in somehow, they all had a slightly agonistic relationship to their fields, and we're interested in other things. So I guess maybe my single closest collaborator my whole life is Catherine Gallagher, you know, who came late from a trade union background, who discovered political theory, who was my very first graduate student. My first week in Berkeley, she came on to do tutorials with me, and God help me, there were actually 6 weeks where I probably knew more political economy than she did. Which 6 weeks. But in case, so she was interested not so much in women's history, but in the issue of patriarchy, in the issue of family and children. And so we did a bunch of workshops on that together. We taught a course together on family and industrialization. We had a reading group. Eli Zaritsky came, for example. So there was Kathy and her interests. And then there was Steve Greenblatt, who became a close collaborator in his historical interests. And then we had these remarkable colleagues in other fields, Svetlana Alpers, who always said she couldn't have done the work she had done if she'd been back at Harvard or at NYU, because it allows you to break out. So I had these colleagues who were just not interested in borders. So that's really that was the formation of this group.
Right. Can I ask, actually, I'm thinking of picking up on Durba's point that the new imperial history wasn't really imaginable without the kind of women's history and gender history that had gone before, and wondering whether the same kind of generalization could be made actually about what was called the new cultural history and couldn't
have been made without
the in other words, that the new cultural history and that the representations, that the reps agenda, was that possible without women's history and gender history? I mean, if you're thinking back on that moment.
That's interesting. I mean, certainly our earliest collaborations were around issues of family. I would say women's history, but issues of family and family formation was crucial. So in that sense, but of course that had it earlier. Someone yesterday mentioned the Cambridge group, and clearly that has an earlier history in theory. So Natalie was one of the patrons of the representations groups, and she published some of her early articles in it. She wasn't actually, in the group, but there were, people like Mike Rogan was deeply interested in masculinity, and he was an important person. I mean, he wrote really brilliant and important Freudian-reflected work on masculinity. So in that sense, I wouldn't say women's history was crucial, but I would say history of gender and history of family and the relationship of family structures to social structures, seeing that in a cultural way rather than in sort of just a structural way was, I think, hugely important for the history of our group.
And can I ask then about Britain, which is Britain as an anchor? Because I think one of the things that is curious is the degree to which a number of people at the time at Berkeley, I'm thinking of Sue, I'm thinking of, to some extent, Vanessa, the people who are around in this cohort who are interested in cross-national and comparative work, and specifically actually Europe. I think Durba's very well addressed the imperial work that came later on. But thinking about that moment, how important do you think Britain was for what was happening at Berkeley?
Well, I think my feeling about this, and you might speak more, that Britain was a place where something very important happened, to wit, the Industrial Revolution. And in my work, it was a place where revolution didn't happen, which was a big problem for some of us in the 60s and 70s. So let's see, Lynn Hunt came to Berkeley in 74, and we taught our first course together in 75. And this was on comparative state formations, and we taught this course until she left. So in that sense, we each saw each other's fields, and we shared students. And then Susanna Barrows came a little bit later, who was important in putting together, I think, I may be wrong, but I think Sue was always interested in World War I, but a paper came out of a conference, several theses came out of a conference that Barrows and I did on the First World War in comparative perspective. So we had people doing German, people doing French at different places. So I think it's that I've always had an interest in teaching with people and seeing British history as an example of something else. I mean, my passion was never Britain per se. I mean, I was one of these Americans who fell in love with Britain. My passion, I fell in love with my teachers. So there's the eroticism of teaching, and I fell in love with the sort of British problematic of British history in European and in world history. So I would say in my work, it's from the beginning, and I think many of my students, like you, did comparative, structured their problems, Sue and Gulachi. Many people structured their questions, but comparatively. So a kind of German Entfremdung of Britain. Why is Britain? Why do they do this when someone else does that, which seems equally plausible?
And was there, what kind of stakes were attached to working on sex?
Sorry?
What kinds of stakes were attached to working on sex? In other words, I'm thinking about this whole question of what is controversial and what seems to carry risks for colleagues.
Well, I mean, what got me working on sex in particular was Itzy Hull. I mean, if you actually want the proximate cause, I mean, I was a little bit of the. I think Sally may have talked about the heyday of social history, the heroic days of social history being over when they began. I wasn't quite clear that they were over, so I struggled with trying to write a kind of socially grounded cultural history. And I remember tried to write a review of what I thought was wrong with Jim Belkovich's book, which I once as deeply admired, and on the other hand I thought was deeply wrong. And I agonized over it. Judy accused me after this review of being a male Mandarin, already at age 29. and I wasn't quick enough to say, what other kind is there? But I really was struggling. It took me a long time to write the review because I was trying to write a kind of social history that probably is not writable. At least I couldn't write it. And other people, the generation behind me, like Ted Kotichek, had real problems doing it, right? So then I said, well, I'd work on the life cycle. And I started the life cycle at birth, and in writing about birth, I started about reproduction. And then ITSE invited me to give a paper at Cornell, and the only thing I had that was new was about reproduction. So I gave this paper, and then she said, what about this, and what about that, and what about the other? And then...
But did you worry, say, for the students that
well,
they
I
would
worried
go
more. I mean,
out
look, the enemies
into-
were, to tell you the truth, there were two people, my colleague, as you know, in Berkeley, I mean, Jerry Feldman thought this was...
I have more to say about Jerry Feldman.
This was,
yeah.
there were some colleagues who, they set up a whole new version of culture, of real history for the students who were doing political economy because of Lynn Hunt and me. So there was that moment. And then there was, and then the sect was sort of controversial in women's history, to tell you the truth, because it used women, as the sex, and it didn't talk about women's experiences, and so I took a lot of flack for that. But it's one of these things where the wonderful thing about American academia when you have tenure is you can do what you please. And I found this problem that I articulated in ITSE's seminar really a problem, and I tried to figure it out, and I wasn't going to stop till I figured it out. And it frankly didn't make a lot of difference to me what Jerry thought or what the criticisms, sometimes near riots I got, right? So in that sense, Berkeley, my colleagues, I got promoted as I was supposed to be promoted. I don't think I've ever, though people thought it was weird and crazy, no one ever stopped me or tried to hinder my career or do anything like that. They groused quietly.
Right, but were you worried?
Or not so quietly.
Were you worried for the students, actually, your students, that they would, the question of employment that Judy raised yesterday?
Well, I don't think any of you worked on quite as wacky stuff as I worked on.
I think Lisa Cody would.
Lisa Cody did. If I had a student wackier than me, it was Lisa Cody, whose first paper at MedHeads was about the rabbit woman of Godalming. Do you guys know about this? The woman who had rabbits, and she built this into a whole theory of childbirth and maternity in the 18th and 19th century. But she did fine. I mean, I think that brilliant work does fine I always told my students, as you know, do what you find intellectually exigent, and it will triumph.
I want to get into this question about what do you think actually was. Is it your sense that there was a loss in the movement from women's history to gender history, as you see reflected in, especially in your students?
A loss.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
in other words, what are the costs of integration?
Well, it's an interesting question. Well, I think it came out yesterday. I think many of us in this sort of cultural history moment did lose sight of the social social sciences. So, if I think of people students on whose committees I served, I quit serving on people in sociology and started serving on people in English. And now it's sort of anthropology, but there was a real break in social science in that, and I thought that was a big loss. And I'm trying to recover some of that. So when I got this Mellon Prize, I spent a big chunk of it on digital history and quantitative history and setting up statistics courses for students. Because I took statistics courses. And at Berkeley, when I got there, the quantitative anthropology lab invited us in, and you actually wanted to count about women and women's wages, and so we lost all that. So I think there is a sense in which that needs to be put back in the story, but I think without losing the cultural, the reason we put culture in to begin with is that you weren't going to get the sort of things you want simply out of social structures and social facts. That's how we began. And so now that you go a little bit to the direction, one needs to put it back. But I guess my sense is something was lost, but it's being regained, and people do work on real women doing real things, just like Natalie did. But the problematic wasn't women. For Natalie, the problematic was always, it was women on top, or it was what someone did in the Reformation, and it was the problem, and women were relevant to solving the problem, but it was, and that's, and I think in some sense, maybe we went too far in the cultural, all of us, in this cultural turn, but I think social science and social is making its way back, and so I find myself on more committees now, and people in these subjects, and in some sense, people like Amy, who works on, comes from a different tradition, who works on genealogy, which is a structural thing, sort of combines a sort of structural account with a cultural account. You do, they're actually, you work on men, but it's the same in your first book.
So let me just interject here, because I want to open this up for questions, because in addition, there are many other students of Tom, many other people who are experience this moment, and lots to say about this transition. But I just want to say actually what I gained from Tom. And this is not just me, this is a large number of Tom students whom I've interviewed. The kind of freedom and play of imagination about topics. And I think this is something that Judy alluded to, which was, you could do it if it were interesting. I think I had a lot more guidance about what was potentially interesting, although all of us dreaded there was some cartoon with a dog who says blah, blah, blah. It's a
Gary Larson cartoon.
Yeah, right. Whatever. Don't tell. I think everyone's sufficiently traumatized by that cartoon not to have it rehearsed again. But the broad sweep, which I think a number of Tom's students have also taken up, and that sense of daring as well. So I came interested in lives. And I think that's been a consistent interest for me as I've proceeded through all of my various specific research interests. And I came with a comparativist rigor from Susan, especially. And I think the way that I think about this question of women's and gender history is very much the issue of the tool in the toolbox. And that for me, the project has been, how do you connect individual lives to social change more broadly? And that's what I've been interested in a sense, all along. And there have been different ways of getting from those very specific, sometimes idiosyncratic and difficult to characterize or generalize about stories to something large about, what constitutes society, how does society change? And that the sort of, as I said, methodological Epicureanism at Berkeley was enormously, enormously significant. Do you want to say anything else, or do you want to open it up?
No, I was just curious. We're starting to talk it now, but I was interested in how the different intellectual formations of Berkeley, both in our department and the university, changed your ways of thinking about problems from when you came from a very different formation.
I think it was mostly the sense. Here I'm thinking about all of the different kinds of seminars. Berkeley was a place that I think unusually at the time where interdisciplinary seminar taking was not just okay, but actually mandated. Everyone had to have a field outside of their department. That's an important structural thing to note. And in that sense, taking classes in comparative historical sociology, so I retained that social scientific bent, which I'm grateful for, and as well as in, I'm thinking about the range of different options that were possible, the kind of methodological openness, the sense that actually daring was valued, and that yes, you would be wrong, but that it was worth it to actually make the attempt, and that a certain kind of explanatory optimism was also valued. And I think I suspect that was a contrast, not with the people sitting here in this room, but with the other options for British history on offer. I think too, and here let me just say a word about the German situation, which, since I think part of what we wanted to do is talk not just about Britain, but also about the situation in France and in Germany, that in the precincts of Berkeley, even someone like Jerry Feldman, who was, above all else, committed to structural explanations, to political history, to economic history, actually to the bridge between them, that's like another kind of boundary breaching that was happening, which was it no longer made sense for people to actually declare themselves, I think in the early 90s, as a social, cultural, or political historian. Most people were trying to do all of those sorts of things. Even so, for Jerry at Berkeley, and I think I may have been Jerry's only female PhD student, and the fact I don't even know the answer to that question is revealing.
I think you were his only female.
Yeah. Even for Jerry, who was someone who notoriously had stood in the way of Isabel Hull being hired, had caused an enormous conflagration in the department, that both because of who he was and also because of the environment in which he operated, there was a sense that he hated cultural history, but plenty of his own students did cultural history, and that he was quite proud of his own students because that was the personality part. But actually the structural part was that he himself encouraged a kind of imagination in his students. I mean, it's not oftentimes what we think about Jerry Feldman, but it's absolutely true. He reveled in individuals. And if you read Army, Industry, and Labor, that's completely true about him. And he also gave fabulous career advice because he was the son of a steel worker. And so he was a man who, when you came to make a job about where there was a difference in pensions, would be able to talk you through it because he actually thought it mattered. He thought having an important pension was really key. So I think that I guess what I want to say is that even someone who I think goes as a retrograde character in the American establishment from which we come, in that context, was very much to be redeemed. Sharon.
That was wonderful. Thank you. I just want to ask you both, but all of us maybe, to talk more about history of sex and history of the body and history of emotions like eroticism. But I think of the moment in Berkeley as one where it was all about the body. Remember everything, the body and this, the body and that. And that was in part the body that was not just a sexual body, but it was also a way to talk about sex and not have to put sex in everything, because it's not always so great for grants. And I think, Tom, you have worked a lot on sex, and more, I think, in the work on masturbation in some ways than in the book Making Sex, where sex didn't mean sex in the sense that I'm using it now. But we've talked some about queer history, and we've heard from some people who do queer history.
What's the last word?
Queer history, lesbian and gay history, and it's clear to me that some of the issues that people who do lesbian and gay history have to do with uncomfortableness around the evidentiary problems of queer history, but some of it is not about even anything like a latent homophobia. It's about discomfort with talking about sex. And there's not that much work on heterosexual sex either. So can you just talk more about the history of sex and where you see that kind of work having gone? Did it dissipate? Is it still going on today? Is there a future to it?
Well, can we start with the history of the body? Yeah. So that grew out of, I had an interest in medicine. And after I got tenure, I got an ACLS grant, which let me go to medical school for 18 months. And I thought that actually doing dissections and putting my hands on patients made a big difference in my life. And Kathy had always been interested, obviously, in the body from a sort of Marxist perspective. So she, in her first book, talks a lot about these images in industrial novels and in factory reports about bodies actually going into products. So she was interested actually in bodies from a fairly not traditional, but from a Marxist version. And so we started teaching this seminar on the history of the body, and we produced this book on the body, which had some impact and actually sold well for Cal Press, and so in some sense started a whole lot of theses in the English department on Dracula and on all kinds of ways in which the body comes into literature. So that's the the body part, and we kept teaching it, and we were fairly serious about bodies. Like the students, actually, they had to go into the anatomy lab for a week, and we paired each student with an anatomy student, and they got whatever they're dissecting, and they got the manual, and they're supposed to dissect. And the braver of the students, we signed them up to go to autopsies, but autopsies are actually a little tough, and so we didn't require it. But we did. We did actually. So students, we were actually interested in the engagement of the body. So that's the body part. And then my part of the interest came out of how bodies come to be sexed, and how they how in a so the gap between biology on the one hand and cultural construals of biology on the other. And obviously, you know, that was a huge issue then. And Gail Rubin came into my life through Lynn Hunt, who knew her from Michigan. And so Gail was a big interlocutor for me from early on, and probably continuously an interlocutor. So, you know, how body sex in a particular way fit into a system. Sherry Ortner was at Berkeley in those days. So my interest in this became this question of a given biology, how does that get construed? And then a lot of people, including my students, criticized me for there being nothing, quote, personal in this book about sex. In fact, no sex in the book about sex, which was right. It's kind of prim. And so there's not a lot more in solitary sex. But I got interested in this question of which is roughly the same sort of question about a given physiological event, that presumably an ahistorical pleasure, that suddenly becomes morally exigent. So that's how I got into that. And that is part of a British Enlightenment project, if I must say, because I got into this because, again, Rory Porter asked me to do a talk and pushed me to go in this direction. I gave a talk, and I got all these questions. And like with Itzy in the first book, the questions kept pushing me. So that's my personal story. But I would say the body and how that figures into teaching would be via my teaching with Kathy, and it grows as much out of Marxism as it does out of Foucault.
Can I interject actually a Jerry Feldman story here? Jerry Feldman said that in the year that I applied, that there were so many liqueur students working, prospective liqueur students who were coming to work on the body, that the whole thing smelled like anesthesia. The room where all these applications were being read was like a... And I have one more story. I think that's about the link between women's history and this moment of the body. Mm. When I was trying to decide where to go, Olwen Houghton said to me, well, you know, Berkeley has these strengths. It said that Tom Liqueur has a large collection of pornography. It has also said it's for his work, which
which is even true.
Which was, I think, she still thought I should go, but this should be known.
So I feel like I absolutely have to say something because this is so reminiscent and so part of the moment. But one of the things that I found so powerful was just the cohort. I mean, I sometimes describe, you know, I'm the slight generation before you, but I arrived, I think there were 20 people doing late modern Europe. I mean, it was like going through graduate school at the baby boom. I mean, there was just, I don't know if you've ever had so many people there working on lots of different national experiences, all kind of on this journey of discovery and kind of pushing each other. And I think that one thing I would echo about Susanna and Reggie and Mary Ryan and Elizabeth Abel in the English department and Sue Schweik and Kathy Gallagher and all of these, and Evelyn Fox Keller, who was there at the time, and making me read all kinds of theoretical things on technology and reproduction that I don't know if appeared in my work but were really important things to read, is the respect that the faculty had for what the students were doing, and the sense that this was a kind of collective conversation. And I'm not sure that existed everywhere. And so I just wanted to say that was one of the things that I really took away from that.
Right, it was one of the specific historical, I think, structural elements of a place like Berkeley or Michigan, which is they had such huge cohorts. I mean, much huger then than are feasible or sustainable now. And I think some of the kind of horizontal connections and even some of the politics that were happening across those kinds of very large groups of people and being worked out there. And it was pretty hard to feel, as a consequence, alone at a place like that. I mean, the difficulty rather was feeling that you were so much part of the zeitgeist, right? That the anesthesia was in the admitting room for everyone, of differentiation.
Can I just, interesting, Sharon's question about gay and lesbian history. It's actually, I mean, I've supervised one person doing gay history, and it was really sort of the social science of gay history. I mean, it's about adolescence and Hall and, intellectual history of social science, in which that was the object. And it's an interesting question that we haven't developed any kind of historical, we haven't figured out or it hasn't been taught. We haven't done it, and I don't think it's out of hostility. Partly it's to do with the social formations of Berkeley. In other words, there was a big divide between queer and gay, and people felt burnt. They didn't want to get into these battles. I mean, I don't know, but it's interesting. It didn't, out of all the interest in gender and sexuality and bodies and all this in our department. I think that wasn't developed. Masculinities were, one of my students did a wonderful piece, also won the British Studies Prize on three-piece suit and masculinity. So it's, lots of things got studied, it's interesting to reflect on why that didn't. And maybe, I don't know if they did in English. There were a few people in English who were working on gay. Bill Cohen worked, right, and I was on his committee. Catherine, but we didn't. I was never aware, never conscious of that. But you're right.
Could I speak to that briefly? Bonnie Anderson from CUNY, and our gay and lesbian history classes had nothing to do with the history department, because the history department never even mentioned the words queer, much less gay and lesbian. It came out of women's studies. And we had a course that was very poorly named called the Lesbian Experience that many students did not want on their transcript, so it would appear as Course X, which wasn't much better. But it was out of that experience of teaching those courses. And when I began teaching women's studies, I was told the one thing you have to teach is about lesbianism. And it was a mandate, in an area that really had so much freedom to it. But what came out of that was CLAGS, the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies at the Graduate Center, which has been a really important resource for the entire CUNY system. I'll say personally, I began teaching the history of sexuality, but not until my hair was gray. Right. And I do think that is a gender difference. I had to be very careful when I began teaching, more careful than my male colleagues who dealt with sexuality, not to fall into the, oh, you're a woman, sex, I want you, whatever, trap. And once my hair was gray and I was considered in America no longer a sexual being, I could say anything. And I could deal with anything in front of the classroom. But we found that, certainly at Brooklyn, sexuality was one of those contested areas. You can't teach history of sexuality because we have anthropology doing it, or biology, and it was an odd experience.
Right. But you say, well, we do teach in our society in the sexist course, obviously taught about, read books on the lesbian, gay experience and so forth. But there was a real, when I said yes to Berkeley's women's studies sort of split, people left it. It was a real split. I mean, the people who did theoretical gay and lesbian, Judy Butler and Wendy, and a bunch of people came into critical theory and other disciplines. And women's studies were left with people who usually do third world something, which is interesting, but it didn't capture the whole group of people who want to do Western or even Central Asian, even Asian issues of sexuality. So there was a kind of, it grew out of an academic split in women's, between gender and women, I would say, that was not good for graduate research, at least.
Anna Clark, just more of a comment than a question, that I think that the history of sexuality, I've kind of moved into that from women's history, and I've never wanted to teach it as gay and lesbian history or queer history, because for me, queer history means doing the whole history of sexuality and refusing sexuality's identity, but it also poses a lot of really interesting and maybe intractable theoretical questions that are, gender is different than sexuality, however you define it. But But we've never had any political problem at Minnesota. We have a lot of very popular courses in history of sexuality, dissident sexualities, and it's been very invigorating having that going on.
Okay, so I'm thinking that we get a sense from this conversation and the conversation yesterday about this kind of permissiveness in the way that you advise or mentor, that anything goes as long as it's interesting. But I think everyone in the room who has been a mentee would say that the question you always pose to your students is, what's the problem? Right? And that, in a way, is the unifying logic for your strategy of advising. And I was just hoping you could say a little bit more about the problem, because that seems like that's the word I associate with you. What's the problem? Even when I pitch a new project, well, what's the problem? And I wonder if the success your students have had, generally speaking, stems from the fact that you really have made it a point to force us to engage women's and gender history, integrate it into broader questions or issues that people coming from other perspectives or disciplines would be able to then engage with us on.
Right. I mean, it's nice of you to say that, and I think that I do think that what the problem is, and I wouldn't say I pose it to be able to integrate it, because you guys have all done the integration. I mean, I don't often work from a literature. How do you? It's not how I work. But if you keep pushing people to say, why does this matter to you? What's you people? I mean, I think it was like a music master class. You know, if you're all competent, it's just saying, well, try it this way, and why is this not? Play a little bit better, and you know, throw your shoulders back and smile. You know what I mean? So there's a sense that I feel my students, the very wide range of topics, all of which have been successful, and I think my contribution has been, in some sense, not supposed to raise your game, but to take very technically competent people and say, what do you really want to say? And I got this a little bit from Peter Brown, who has this metaphor that I love about. He says, you have to feel there's a grain of sand in your shoe. And you kind of want to work it out. It has to actually be hurting you. And so that's the kind of, and then I have confidence. I think all my students have been brilliant, and if you just keep pushing it, they figured this. I mean, I don't have to say this is how it integrates into the field. You guys all know the field better than I do, and you figure it out. But my part is saying, don't stop now. And that's what my colleagues have always done for me. I mean, people like Kathy and Steve Greenblatt, they always say, well, it's fine, but really? And then you sort of say, okay, I'll try to up my game. And at some point you give up. I mean, your game is only so good. but you do keep trying to just say, this is, this is what matters to me. And then you integrate it, and then you integrate all these parts on your own.
And Tom was also the master of the bringing in the thing that you think couldn't possibly be relevant and trying to ask you to explain why it might be relevant, which is, I think, another version of the so what question. Thank you all. Thank you.